We all know that one person. That one person that picks their bracket based on which mascot they think would win in a fight. Well, today, I will be doing exactly that and picking my bracket based on which mascots I think would beat the other ones in a fight. So, starting off the bracket, you got the Auburn Tigers versus the Alabama State Hornets or the St. Francis Friars. And I'm going to take the Tigers. I think they would be either the Friars or the Hornets, even though I do like the Friars to beat the Hornets in the playing game. Moving down to Louisville versus Creighton, I'm going to take the Blue Jays in this one. More aggressive bird, I think they win that. Next up, you got the Michigan Wolverines versus UC San Diego Tritons, and I'm going to take the Tritons. Pointy sword, I don't even think a Wolverine could get close enough to take it down, and if it did, how would it take it down, It might have defense, but there's no offense there. Next up, you got Texas A&M. They're the Aggies versus the Yale Bulldogs, and I'm going to take the Aggies. Cowboys got a few tricks up their sleeve. I don't think the Bulldogs stand a chance in this one. Next up, you got the Ole Miss Rebels versus the San Diego State Aztecs or the UNC Tar Heels. And so in the first playing game, I'm going to take the Aztecs, and then I'm also going to take the Aztecs to knock off the Rebels, so they're going to move on to the round of 32. Next up, you got Iowa State Cyclones versus the Lipscomb Bison, and I'm going to take the Cyclones. It's a classic Great Plains matchup, but in the end, you got to take Iowa State. They're right there. They're the Cyclones. I don't see a Cyclone taking out a Bison too often, but when I do, I've never seen a Bison take out a Cyclone. Next up, you got the Marquette Golden Eagles versus the New Mexico Lobos, and I'm going to take the Lobos here. This is the one where I was thinking about it for a while. You got Eagles, they got their talons, they can fly, or you got the Lobos. Wolves typically hunt in packs. I think that's exactly how they're going to take down the Eagles here. Lure them in with some mice, and you got that. Next up, you got the Michigan State Spartans versus the Bryant Bulldogs. I think the Spartans take this game with ease. Give me them to move on to the round of 32. So, kicking off the West, you have the Florida Gators versus the Norfolk State Nittany Lions. And I'm going to take the Gators. I see this as being a swampy matchup. Gators are the better team, and I think that gives them home court advantage. And when you put it in a swamp, Gators are going to dominate all day. Next up, you got the Yukon Huskies versus the Oklahoma Sooners, and I'm going to take the Huskies here. They can hunt in packs just like the Lobos, and the Sooners, they're just moving. They got nothing with them. They got the wagon in their group, and I don't think that's enough to take down a group of experienced Huskies. Next up, you got the Memphis Tigers versus the Colorado State Rams. This is another game, Predator versus Prey, and I'm going to take the Tigers. I think it's pretty easy. Next up, you got the Maryland Terrapins versus the Grand Canyon Antelopes, and this is a pretty weak matchup if you ask me. I had a pretty tough time with it. I did end up going with Maryland. They are the higher seed, and to be honest, I feel like a turtle, if it gets angry, it can be pretty feisty. Take it down right there. Next up, you got the Missouri Tigers versus the Drake Bulldogs, and I think a Tiger dominates this matchup all day. Give me the Missouri Tigers. Next up, you got the Texas Tech Red Raiders versus the Seahawks, and I'm going to take the Red Raiders. They've probably got a pistol or something up their sleeves, and, I don't think a Seahawk can defend against that. Next up, you got the Kansas Jayhawks versus the Arkansas Razorbacks, and I'm going to take the Razorbacks all day. They can be pretty mean animals. They can be pretty aggressive. They can be pretty defensive. They got all sides of the ball. I'm going to take the Razorbacks right there. Next up, you got the St. John's Red Storm versus the Omaha Mavericks, and I'm going to take the Mavericks. Red Storm, it sounds pretty intimidating at first, but it's not really a storm. It's just Native Americans, and I'm going to take the Mavericks right there. Moving on to the east side of the bracket, you got the Duke Blue Devils versus the American Eagles or Mount St. Mary's Athenians. And so in the playing game, I'm going to take the Athenians. I think they have it to do it over the Eagles. You know, the Eagles can fly, but in the end, you got a group of people. I think they can strategize more than the Eagles could. And in the 1 vs 16 matchup, I'm going to take the Blue Devils over the Athenians. You know, I think they've got their guns. Blue Devils, a form of French soldier, nickname given to them, and I think they move on to the second round. Next up, you got the Mississippi State Bulldogs versus the Baylor Bears. And again, I think the Bears, they're just much more strong, much more powerful. I think they take that matchup. Next up, moving on, you got Oregon Ducks versus the Liberty Flames. Now, I see the Flames as a dark horse candidate because who is stopping a Flame? You know, and it's not going to be a Duck. I got the Flames moving on. Next up, you got the Arizona Wildcats versus the Akron Zips. And in this matchup, I had to take the Wildcats. True story, a zip is actually a type of rubber shoe. And I don't think a rubber shoe is beating Wildcat. You know, Wildcat's going to tear it up right there. Next up, you got BYU, and they're the Cougars versus the VCU Rams. And I think a Cougar, Predator versus Prey matchup easily takes down a Ram. Next up, you got the Wisconsin Badgers versus Montana Grizz. And I think the Grizz win this pretty easily. You know, another type of bear versus a smaller animal. I think bigger beats smaller in this case. I'm going to take Montana Grizz to win that game. Next up, you got the St. Mary's Gales versus the Vanderbilt Commodores. And you know, this is trained people, trained fighters versus just a group of Irish people. And I think the trained fighters are going to win any scenario you got them in. Next up, you got the Alabama Crimson Tide versus the Robert Morris Colonials. And I'm going to take the Colonials in this one, you know? Not sure what a Crimson Tide is, but it's not something that's beating the Colonials. Starting off with the Midwest, you have Houston Cougars versus the SIUE Cougars, and I'm going to take Houston. They got the better seed. Same with Gonzaga versus Georgia, Bulldog versus Bulldog. I'm going to take the 8 seed over the 9 seed. Next up, moving on, you got Clemson Tigers versus the McNeese Cowboys, and I'm going to take the Clemson Tigers here. You know, Cowboys, they got that fight in them, but I don't see them beating Clemson or the Tigers. Next up, you got the Purdue Boilermakers versus the High Point Panthers, and I think a Boilermaker is going to crush them, you know? Rides over the tracks, you can't stay there, bud. Next up, you got Illinois versus Texas or Xavier, and so I'm going to take the Musketeers of Xavier to knock off Texas and then go in to play the Fighting Illini and knock them off too. You know, you got your muskets. I don't think anyone beats that. Next up, you got Kentucky versus Troy, and I think the Trojans take this matchup right here. You know, how is a Wildcat going to take down a fighting force that's trained? Moving on, you got UCLA versus Utah State, and I'm going to take the Bruins here. You know, they're the Aggies, they're feisty, they're Cowboys, but in the end, they're Bears. You know, that's their environment, that's where they're going to thrive. Next up, you got the Tennessee Vols versus the Wofford Terriers, and this was a pretty weak matchup for me too. I will take the Volunteers, but weak matchup overall. Now on to the round of 32, you got the Auburn Tigers versus the Creighton Blue Jays, and I'm going to take the Tigers here. You know, I don't think the Blue Jays, they can knock off a team like the Cardinals, but with a Tiger, I don't think they're beating them. Next up, you got the UC San Diego Tritons versus the Texas A&M Aggies, and I got the Tritons moving on. You know, I think they can penetrate the Aggies, get where they need to poke, and I don't think the Aggies are going to be able to take them down. You know, you can't use traditional weaponry on them. Moving on to San Diego State versus Iowa State, and I'm going to take the Cyclones here. You know, the Aztecs, I don't think they outduel a tornado in any sense. Next up, you got the Lobos versus the Spartans, and this is another case of a fighting, trained army versus an army of wolves that's going to be pretty good, but not going to get you to where you want to go in the end. I'm going to take the Spartans here. Now into the round of 32 for the West, and I'm going to take the Gators over the Huskies. You know, another swampy matchup for the Gators. Very favorable when you're versing a team like the Huskies, who's used to cold weather climate and snow. Next up, you got the Memphis Tigers versus the Maryland Terrapins. And the Terrapins, you know, they won a weak matchup overall. And I'm going to take the Memphis Tigers in a pretty big blowout. Next up, you got the Missouri Tigers versus the Texas Tech Red Raiders. And again, I'm going to take the Tigers. You know, Tigers are feisty, vicious animals, and I think they could take them down pretty easy. Next up, you got the Arkansas Razorbacks versus the Omaha Mavericks. And a Maverick is just going to take down a Razorback every time, you know, bigger and stronger. As much and as feisty as a Razorback can be, a Maverick in the end is going to beat them. Now into the East round of 32, you got the Duke Blue Devils versus the Baylor Bears. And I'm going to take the Blue Devils here, you know. They got their weapons. They're a soldier fighting force, and you can knock out a bear pretty quickly with that. Next up, moving on, you got the Flames versus the Wildcats. And I think a flame, you know, they can go multiple ways, you know, burn them or burn their habitat, burn their home. And either way, I think the Flames win this. Next up, you got the BYU Cougars versus the Montana Grizzlies. And I'm going to take the Grizzlies here, you know. Classic matchup. You know, you don't see it in the wild much, but I'm sure it'd be fun to think about. And I think the Grizzlies are going to take that one. Next up, you got the Commodores versus the Colonials. And to be honest, this is like the American Revolution. And I think it goes the opposite way. I think the trained army would win this, with the Commodores taking the win in this one. Last up for the round of 32 is the Midwest, and you got the Cougars versus the Bulldogs. I'm going to take the Cougars. I don't think the Bulldogs make it past the second round. And next up is the Tigers versus the Boilermakers. And I'm actually going to take the Boilermakers here. You know, how is a Tiger going to take down a Boilermaker? I just don't see it happening. Next up, you got the Musketeers versus the Trojans. And this is just a classic case of old versus new. And I'm going to take new. You know, the Musketeers are much more advanced than the Trojans weapon-wise. And I don't think the Trojans have a way of getting past the front lines of the Musketeers. Lastly, you got the UCLA Bruins versus the Tennessee Vols. And I'm going to take the Bruins in this matchup, you know. The Vols, they got out of a weak group with the Wofford Terriers, but I don't think they get past the Bruins in this one. Into the Sweet 16, you have Auburn versus UC San Diego. So, Tigers versus Tritons. And I'm going to take the Tritons here. You know, I think they knock off the Tigers. There's no way to knock them down. You know, you can't beat them. Next up, you got the Cyclones versus the Spartans. And I'm going to take the Cyclones, you know. As trained as a Spartan is, they're not going to know how to defend themselves against a Cyclone. I think the Cyclones take it there. Next up, you got the UC San Diego Tritons versus the Iowa State Cyclones. And I'm going to take the Cyclones, you know. Just as much as the Tritons were doing, you can't beat the Cyclones, you know. They're gonna find a way to get around you, and there's no defense you can play. Into the Sweet 16, you have Florida Gators versus the Memphis Tigers. And I'm going to take the Gators, you know. Water and land, they're very versatile versus a Tiger, which has been winning all tournament throughout the bracket, but I think they get taken down here. Same thing with the Mavericks versus the Tigers in another bracket, and I'm going to take the Mavericks to win. So in this Elite 8, you got the Florida Gators versus the Omaha Mavericks, and I'm going to take the Gators to move on to the Final Four. As crazy as that sounds, I think a Gator could take down a Maverick. Moving into the East region, you got the Duke Blue Devils versus the Liberty Flames. And I'm going to take the Flames, you know. A Blue Devil can only do so much with a gun and firepower. I think the only way to take out a flame is with water. And I don't think you do that there. You got the Montana Grizzlies versus the Vanderbilt Commodores. And I'm going to take the Commodores here. You know, you got the Commodores. I think they have the technology, the weaponry to take down a grizzly bear, even a pack of them. Next up, you got the Liberty Flames versus the Vanderbilt Commodores. Give me the Flames here, You take down one of their bases with a flame, you go after them personally. I think you win that matchup either way if you're the Flames. Rounding out the Sweet 16, you got the Midwest bracket with the Houston Cougars and the Purdue Boilermakers. And I'm going to take the Boilermakers. A train is going to plow through a Cougar. And what's a Cougar going to do on offense, How's it going to take down a train? I just don't see that happening. Next up, you got the Xavier Musketeers versus the UCLA Bruins. Give me the Musketeers here, train fighters. You got your muskets, you got guns. I think that can take out a bear easily. Moving on to the Elite 8, you got the Purdue Boilermakers versus the Xavier Musketeers. And I think a train plows through the Musketeers, I'm going to take Purdue to move on to the Final Four. In the last matchups, you've got Iowa State Cyclones versus the Florida Gators. And this is a matchup where you finally got the Gators out of their comfort zone. You blow them away, blow them out of the water. Even if they want to hide under there, what's their defense going to be? I got the Cyclones moving on. Next up, you got the Flames versus the Boilermakers. And this is a matchup where I see the Boilermakers, they take advantage of Flames. That's how they power their ships. That's how they power their boats. That's how they move the boats. That's how they move the logs. And that's how they're going to get to the national championship. They knock off the Flames. In the national championship, you got the Cyclones versus the Boilermakers. And this is a game where I see Iowa State taking advantage. They're going to knock Purdue off their wheels early with the wind, and then they're just going to keep pushing it over, leave debris all over the tracks, and I don't see a way Purdue counters that with their Boilermaker. Give me the Cyclones for the win. National champions, the Iowa State Cyclones.